A continuación nos va a acompañar un auténtico...
Let me now give the floor to an expert on neuroscience, Dr. Pedro Bermejo. In order for you to have an idea of his profile, allow me to just read some of his achievements. He's a neurologist, founder and president of the Spanish Association of Neuroeconomics, medical director of the Walter Therapies. He's founder of the Institute of Neuroeconomics and Value Investment and manager of the Neurological Institute Comprehensive of Medellin. He's a gold medal to Merit of the World. He's got more than 200 scientific articles published. How's the process of taking decisions? How can we influence in those processes? What happens in the brain when we use the halo or manada or Google effects? Do you want to know how your brain works and the brain of your customers? Let's let Pedro Bermejo tell us.
Bueno, pues buenos días, muchas gracias por la presentación.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your kind presentation. Thank you for being here today at these late hours. And I'm going to talk to you about how our brain works. The brain is the most complex structure. I only have 20 minutes, and the decision-making process is the most complex part, really. We are constantly taking decisions. You need to decide if you're going to attend this meeting or not. Your client is going to decide if they buy your product or not. All this information is going to be processed by your client's brain or your brain. And in order to do so, we have defined a new part of neuroscience that is going to study how we take decisions. And we've called it neuroeconomy, and you may claim that neuromarketing is another version of this neuroeconomy, but at the end of the day we are talking about neuroscience, a scientific process, the application of a scientific method, and the decision-making process. Neuroeconomy, neuromarketing is perceived as something really modern, but in the Middle Ages we already knew that you had to sell a product, you were smiling at your client, and therefore you had more chances to sell it. That's the biggest difference. MRA today allows you to take any one of you, put them on the MRA box, and directly with the adequate program, we will know if they are going to purchase the product or not. With all the MRA techniques, we can gain an insight into how our brain works when we take decisions. This, globally speaking, is the scheme I'm going to follow to try and explain this. The most important thing is the first part. What we see today is the balance between the brain reward and loss aversion. When we see a product, when we need to take a decision, when your customer sees your product, they need to decide whether they buy it or not. Part of his brain is going to be activated, is going to be triggered. The brain reward system is going to be triggered whereas the loss negative part is going to be linked to the loss aversion system. If you manage to trigger the reward system more than the loss one, your client is going to buy your product. If you tend to trigger the no system, the loss aversion, they won't buy. This is a balance between both parts. One part of the brain sees the positive thing and the other one sees the negative thing. We have an awful lot of information on these two structures. The brain reward system involves all these structures. We will talk about the ventral tegmental area, the accumbens nuclei, other structures that have to do with are the most complex structures. The accumbens nuclei has to do with the quantity of the benefit, whereas the prefrontal cortex analyzes the probability of success. This is more complex and it assesses our needs. So put it differently, if we manage to approach your client from the emotional method, you are activating your accumbens nuclei. If you touch upon the rational part, how much do they need the product, you are getting there through the prefrontal cortex. And emotions and reasons have clearly defined areas in your brain that shall be or could be modified based on such biases that you have mentioned, goggle, halo, and so on. One of my preferred ones is the goggle effect. It has nothing to do with Google effect. Think about your client in a basal mode. Give them something appealing. Let's say, okay, since we're in a bank, we go to the bank, you go to the branch, the head of the bank welcomes you, that you sit down, you're invited to coffee. The coffee that is stimulating your brain is also stimulating the accumbens nuclei, the core. So you're in a system in which partially we are going to revert the system towards the reward system. And when we need to take the decision whether we buy or not, the pension scheme, for instance, quite likely we will end up buying such product. They are influencing us with coffee or with the goggle effect. Halo effect is well known, you all know it. It's stimulated through the accumbens core, the transmission of something positive of somebody in particular towards the product they are using. David Beckham, a very sexy individual who's announcing a shaver. So I will find this shaving machine more positively than other machines because it is linked to somebody who's very positive. The other lady, I don't know what she's buying, but I'll buy it anyway because they are stimulating me emotionally, not reasonably. I mean, I don't have a need for anything. George Clooney with a lovely coffee, and other individuals that are selling other financial products that shall be extraordinary. Well, here we have a little bit of everything. And in terms of the loss aversion system, it's less known. A lot of structures are involved. Remember the words insula, and there are 2 studies, and the cappuccini monkeys and the tonsils. And we have 2 normal subjects with no brain injuries. Obama. If I'd put another president of the government, that wouldn't be so clear. And then patients with brain injuries, with a brain hemorrhage, and also nictus on the amygdala. And we're going to do an experiment with them in 20 rounds. And we're going to have $1 at stake. They can either save the $1, I don't want to know anything of anyone, or, it's at stake. If I toss it, if it's expensive, every $1 I will receive 2.5. And if I lose, no money. Reasonably, what's worth it? In those 20 rounds, if I keep the $1, I will keep $20. If I'm always playing it, well, statistically, I will normally win $25, so I'd rather play this. So the normal subjects with no brain injuries, the investment percentage is at 57%. After a failed investment, only 40%. So I just lost. I'm not going to play it again. The average profit is $22.88. The patients with brain injuries, investment, 83%. After a failed investment, 82% that have no brain area that is going to detect the risk. The average profit, more, 24. If you're going to play this game, and if I do the brain injuries in those areas you allow me to do, you'll make more money. Please bear this in mind. Your brains are not ready to make money. Your brains were ready to survive 50,000 years ago. The world has changed, but we have not done so. And we are not prepared for the current society. And this is part of the mistakes we are living today. The cappuccini monkey study, we take monkeys, we train them. 22% of their DNA is very similar to us, so they will have different behaviors. We're going to play a game. We're going to give them coins, and you give a coin to Homer Simpson, he gives them a banana. And there is a 50% chance that a few minutes after that, they'll give them another one. When they make business with the other gentleman, they give them a coin and they give them 2 bananas, and a few minutes afterwards, they have to eat the bananas, obviously. There's a 50% likelihood of them removing the banana. Who do you think they prefer making business with? very few people would prefer making business with the gentleman to the right. If you go to the branch director, I give you a 4% interest rate, and as you walk out of the door, they say, well, no, it's not going to be 4, it's going to be 2%. You will never do business with him again because of the risk aversion we all have. We hate losing something. Risk aversion is going to be perceived everywhere. This is one of the typical examples of the real estate housing crisis a few years ago. If my house was worth 500,000 euros, how am I going to sell it for 180,000 euros? For that money, I will wait for 40 years. Don't talk to me about the loss of opportunity, interest rates. Forget it. I won't lose any money. Well, by the look of things, we were wrong. Mirror neurons are those brain structures, those neurons that are triggered when we see somebody taking a decision and then we imitate that person. So if my brother-in-law buys a house, my cousin as well, and my neighbor as well, all of a sudden I will have a trend to follow this, and that's how the situation we're meeting, and that's why we buy in the highest points of the housing bubble and we sell on the lowest points of the housing bubble when everything is declined. This is the example of the housing bubble. We were saying prices never go down. It's better to buy your property than renting. Bubbles have always existed with the tulips. Technological bubbles, the dot-com bubble, and in neuromarketing we are also experiencing this mirror neuron marketing. So, well, if you have that signage saying sold, no, you're not gonna call. This is not only oriented to the person who's willing to buy, but also those willing to sell. It tells those willing to sell, oh, look, contact Tecnocasa. We've sold this gentleman's house. So this is another way of capturing new clients. We are sort of influencing. The insula and amygdala, these are structures that are behind risk aversion, and they are behind the knock-on effect. This is related to one area that has to do with pain. If I step on your foot is going to transfer some feelings to the rest of your body. There is another way that goes to the amygdala. I don't like this. That is a message. The pain, how interestingly, it's going to stimulate the same structure when we do the opposite to what the rest of the group is doing. If everyone here just dash off, the two people here, we are going to start having the other amygdala. I feel awfully, and I'll tend to just dash off like the rest of the people. And same happens when all the rest are going to buy iPhone 11, 12, 13. When you all buy it, and if I don't have it, my amygdala is going to be stimulated. We are manipulated. This insula is going to be only stimulated with things that are not socially well perceived. iPhone 27, this is going to be for free for you. But if you grab it, 3 kids in Africa will die right now. Well, is it worth it? So what tells you is don't buy it. What's behind it is your insular cortex. This also has an influence on consumers. So if you add something that has to do with child abuse, pornography, or anything unfair, your client is not going to buy that product. What's not socially admitted? Homosexuality 50 years ago was the use of condoms is not so well perceived. And think about the lower image. You have to the right Iran in the 1970s. Think about Iran today. So things change with the passing of time. So you always have to adapt your campaigns to your whole target. And the generation of patterns, the other problem our brain is facing. If I tell you 1, 2, and your brain says 3, and I say 44, your brain is stimulated all of a sudden. So this is not what I believe. This is what's generating as a surprise that is going to increase your memory and your need to consume. It's going to make you more impulsive, and you're going to be able to use that with your customers. This is well known in economy. This is the Japanese tsunami in 2011. Nobody was expecting this. This is what happened with the Nikkei index, with two massive declines. One of them was rational and the other one emotional. No one was expecting it. The drop line, the rational one, it recovered quickly after these massive buys. Then reason comes in and we adapt to the back situation. And you can use this in neuromarketing to strike other people's attention. Anything that strikes your attention, that is a surprise. For instance, this gentleman, I don't want to go to the gym. I take a look at this fitness center. These are other examples that play with surprise. The tomato example, how interesting. Or buses announcing the zoo. Think about the yellow line and the underground. Be careful with the yellow line, but if you use Wonder Bra, just but go a little bit behind. You have numerous examples. And lastly, the idea that we weren't so independent when we take decisions. We have a full bias because of exogenous and endogenous influences. There's studies in decision making, the difference between men and women. A quick study shows you that memories are quite different, brains are different between men and women. So we give several images to men and women. One of them has a neutral content, flower, houses, and others with positive or negative content. A corpse, somebody kissing, an image of a horrible surgery 3 days afterwards. We ask men and women, what is it that you recollect? Men and women remember exactly the same. Those images with an neutral emotional content. This is men, whereas women tend to remember the most those images with positive or negative emotional content. And this means that women tend to remember the emotions related to an economic loss in a crisis moment, and men would continue to buy after a downturn. This allows us to adapt the behavior of men and women in economic cycles. We also know that the amount of testosterone that both men and women have is going to change our patterns of consumption, making us more compulsive or less. A woman with more testosterone, which you also have, is going to be more impulsive. And this is also related to certain DNA alterations and genes that are behind the compulsive buying. Things like light intensity. In those days that are biggest sales, the stock exchange goes up. There's problems of attention. Things like the moon cycles, we cannot dive into this, but it's so interesting. You go to the ER system, and so interestingly, on biggest moon, there's more abortion, epileptic, migraines, crisis, upside down, and the stock exchanges go down because people tend to have more depression and buy less. And if you are taking some pharmaceutical drugs, well, Sumial removes the risk perception, propranolol. If you're quiet, I'm going to have less risk perception and I'd be able to buy in a riskier fashion. There is a study that is statistically significant, showing the intake of propranolol and the increase of profits in stock exchange. And we may be getting into muddy waters here. Oral contraceptives. These also changes our emotional memory, thyroid, for things for Parkinson, antidepressants, anti-epileptic. Anything that touches your body in one way or another is influencing the way in which you take decisions. All those drugs do not only attack the area of efficacy, they expand around all the brain, and they also touch the area that's responsible behind taking decisions. Can we avoid all these biases? Yes, of course. There are certain strategies at a few broad strokes. No, I'm not the seller now, I'm the buyer. Time. The more time it takes you to buy something, the more you think about it, the more reasonable this will be. Come on, hurry up. They're going to get it from me. No, this isn't useful for somebody buying. Useful information. If I'm a telephone engineer, I study something different. I wouldn't rely upon my brother-in-law. We are talking about useful information. I may have 3,000 pages giving you reviews about that thing in particular. I'd rather have useful information and personal support. If you've got somebody recommending you, it's going to be less emotional when you take a specific decision. And lastly, what's the way to go? We are talking about some brain structures that are related to the decision-making process, and we will be able to carry out individual tests, and we will be able to measure genes. We know there are specific genes related to neurotransmitter that is related to certain ways in which we take decisions. We are more or less risky depending on whether this is touching upon you or not. We will be able to touch upon this. We may buy more or less if depending on the drugs that you take. And if I had time, we'll show you a specific example with a specific drug we were giving to patients to our patients, and with colors and impulsive buying, which is mainly associated to specific drugs in particular of the pharmaceutical industry. So the role of neuroscience in the decision-making process. So I'm very clear about this. So please pay attention. Thank you. That's my advice.